my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, still in the new space, still futzing with things. You may notice I've added some sparkly light up vine things. I'm rethinking some of my hat hanging and still messing with camera angles and lighting. But today I'm doing what should be another short, easy video. This is going to be another entry in my anthology video series where I talk about 5 stories at a time in any given anthology. This is meant so that I can do review-ish content without committing to actually finishing any books. For example, my first 2 videos in this series were wrapping up batches of stories from The Green Man Tales of the Mythic Forest, and I am jumping ship here and I'm talking about a different anthology. I'm going to be talking about the first 5 pieces in The Book of Dragons, edited by Jonathan Strahan. This was a 2020 release of all original stories and poems for this collection, with a roster of authors that is truly impressive. It's also got beautiful wraparound cover design and interior illustrations by Rovina Cai, who is one of my favorite fantasy illustrators and is nominated for a Hugo this year for, among other things, this book and the illustrations and cover art for Elatsoe by Darcy Little Badger. So this was a book that I pre-ordered because I was so very excited for it, and I started reading it as Hugo nominations in March were coming to a close, and I realized I hadn't read any 2020 short fiction, and I had this collection that I had been so highly anticipating of all new stuff published in 2020 that was all eligible. So I actually read the first 10 pieces in this in one go, but I'll be dividing those 10 into 2 different videos. I did want to get those videos filmed and wrapped up before I totally forget about these stories. I was looking for things to nominate in the short fiction categories, but I only in those 10 pieces, which were 8 stories and 2 poems, found one story that I loved enough to nominate, and that story will be in this particular batch. So I'm going to touch briefly on the introduction to this book, written by the editor, Jonathan Strahan. It is only like less than 3 pages long, and it is more of a personal reflection on what dragons mean to us than a particularly academic or informational piece of writing, or even something that gives you a really good sense of what to expect from the stories in the collection. It wasn't particularly noteworthy for me, but it's sort of obligatory, it has to be there. And then the first piece, the opening piece of the anthology, is this extremely short poem. You can see that's it, that's all it is, by Jane Yolen. It's called What Heroism Tells Us, and as the title suggests, it is a little bit more about heroism than about dragons. The dragon in that is just sort of a passing reference. I do like Jane Yolen's poetry, though. I would recommend finding Baba Yaga, which is like a novella in verse by her that I liked a lot. And she has 2 poems in this collection, both the first and the final piece in the book, which is an interesting choice. The first full story in this book is called Matriculation by Elle Katharine White, who is an author whose books I had actually heard of before, even though I didn't recognize her name. She wrote Heartstone, which is the first in, I think, a series that was described as like Pride and Prejudice, Regency romance with dragons. There are 3 books in that series now, and honestly, I never heard much about them after that first one was released. So this story sort of, to me, straddles the line between more traditional high fantasy and urban fantasy in its setting. The world building was the most interesting part of it. There's definitely sort of a modern sensibility in the setting of the city where this takes place, but not like modern computer technology or anything, and it does feel like, oh, this is the capital of the fantasy kingdom. So I may be having a hard time describing that, but it was a very original fantasy world, and it was something where, like, I might read a whole novel set in a world like that if it existed. The story is about a girl who has a giant mechanical dragon that's like her family legacy is this sort of steampunkish giant dragon that she puts a lot of effort into maintaining and, you know, riding the dragon like it's her vehicle. And she is getting ready to start at the university as a student studying magitech, which is a thing. And ultimately the story is about the economic pressures of obtaining higher education. That's what it's about. I'm not sure this worked on me emotionally the way it was meant to. There was something that I think was meant to be an emotional twist in the plot that I had sort of assumed from the beginning, so it didn't surprise me. Ultimately, the world building of this one was more interesting to me than the story itself. And then the next story was the one I really loved, and I may mess up the pronunciation of this, but it is Hikayat Sri Bujang, or The Tale of the Naga Sage by Zen Cho. I really like Zen Cho's fiction. I think especially her short fiction that I've read, and it always reminds me when I read something of hers that I really need to read more of her work. I still haven't picked up The Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water, which was one of my most anticipated books of last year, and now she's got a whole nother novel out, Blackwater Sister, so I'm so behind on her stuff. But this was such a good story. This is set in contemporary Malaysia, and it's about a Naga sage who has been living on this mountain as like the sage of the mountain for a really long time, you know, rejecting worldly concerns and seeking enlightenment and all that, until one day his sister shows up and tells him that he has to come back to like their magic underwater kingdom because their father is sick and dying, and he has family responsibilities, and he's his father's heir, and wasn't it horribly irresponsible of him to run off and live on a mountain all these years? And so faced with this situation, he goes back home and has to confront whether he's actually as wise as he sort of thought he was. And there are so many lovely layers in this story. There's the family dynamic, the sibling dynamic. There are plot threads about each of these two siblings' interactions with the human world, and ultimately it sort of talks about the balance between nature and the human world and the magical world, and what happens when that balance is thrown off. And this is the sort of short fiction storytelling that to me feels complete in and of itself. It has all of these beautiful layers and themes in it, but it doesn't feel like it's trying to set up something bigger, like the potential plot or world building for a novel or series. It didn't leave me feeling like it was just a taste of something. This felt like a whole meal. And to me, that is ultimately one of the things I really look for in short fiction. I realize I should probably be showing you the illustrations for each of these stories, because there is a little illustration at the beginning of each story. So this was the one for Matriculation, and this is the one for Hikayat Sri Bujang, or The Tale of the Naga Sage. It's on the crease there, but I think that's really nice. And then the next story is Yuli by Daniel Abraham. You've got a little dragon sitting on a hoard of coins that are sprinkling down the page. Daniel Abraham is an author who is best known as one half of the writing team that is James S.A. Corey. And I haven't read anything that he's written either solo or in collaboration before, and I wasn't super impressed by this one, but mostly it just wasn't my thing. It's not my type of story. Strictly, this isn't a speculative story at all, even though it is riffing on fantasy themes and ideas. The protagonist is the title character, Yuli, and he is a retired mercenary. I think the backstory we get for him is that like he was a child soldier and then became a mercenary in the Middle East, and now he's living in the United States, sort of laying low with all of that in his past. And he has a grandson who is living with him. And throughout the story, the grandson like has his friends over and they're playing what I assume is D&D. I haven't played D&D myself, so I would not recognize if it were a similar game and not that one, but you get the idea. And in the game, the kids are like going to find a dragon to seek the dragon's hoard. And it cuts between this storyline of the kids and their game and Yuli himself, who is metaphorically the dragon sitting on a hoard, and realizing that someone is coming for that hoard. As a dragon story, it's sort of thematically about why a dragon would hoard the gold. More broadly, I'd say it's probably meant to be a meditation on, the innocence of the kids enjoying their fantasy game when the real world equivalent is extremely brutal and real. So I think this isn't without value in this collection, but again, just not my type of story. Not actually a fantasy story. And then A Whisper of Blue by Ken Liu is the 5th story in this collection, the 5th piece if you count the poem, and probably my 2nd favorite in this batch. It's told as like the transcript of a documentary about a small town with an infestation of tiny dragons in an alternate timeline where the world's energy source comes from harnessing the magic of dragons in ways that are sort of mysterious and shrouded, and no one's really allowed to know how we turn dragon energy into electricity. But this is told sort of like a documentary with interviews from a bunch of different residents of this town, chronicling how this sort of small, economically impoverished American town suddenly got an infestation of itty-bitty tiny dragons, and how they wanted to try to harness that somehow into economic prosperity. Can they monetize their dragons in some way? And sort of slowly realizing that they cannot exactly monetize itty-bitty dragons in any particularly helpful way. It was just really, really creative, and that's what I appreciated about it. And it did do a really good job, I think, of sort of interweaving this small town story with giving you slowly clues of all of this alternate history. It was a fun experience. I was a little underwhelmed by some of the sort of takeaway messages that felt maybe a little bit tacked on at the end. But other than that, it was pretty good. I enjoyed it. I didn't enjoy it enough to say, I need to nominate this for a Hugo, and I did have empty spaces on my nominating ballot, but it's a fine story. This one only has a teeny tiny illustration to accompany it. So there you have it. That's a little mini wrap-up of the first 5 things in the Book of Dragons, 1 poem, 4 stories. As far as I'm aware, none of these have been reprinted online anywhere yet, but if they are, or if they are in the future, I will try to remember to come back and add links in the video description. Anyhow, do feel free to leave a comment and let me know if you've read this book, if you're interested in this book. Also, please let me know if you really love the work of any of the authors that I've mentioned in this video. Part of the fun thing about doing this anthology series is getting to just talk about the writing style, the work of a bunch of different authors, and maybe reflect on what else I have or haven't read by them, what else I maybe should read by them. So feel free to leave me a comment, let's chat. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.